arrive if they do. But yeah, so this chat today is about logging contracts. I appreciate you all coming because it's not the most exciting topic for a lot of people, but if you need a logging contract, I suppose it is. So I'm going to kind of walk you through our main logging contract template here and discuss a little bit about why we include each section in that. Um, I do have images of each section of the contract on the slides, so you can kind of get a sense of how the actual contract sections look, but don't feel like you need to actually read through every word as we go. I'm going to kind of summarize and discuss each section. And then afterwards, I am also, we'll send this template to all of you so that you can review it as much as you'd like later. And this chat will also be on YouTube, so you could reference it in the future. So you'll have a chance to look over it in more detail if you want to later. And as I go, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I can stop and answer those if it makes sense right then. Or well, I'll also I think have some time at the end for any questions that you've got. And oh, I forgot to say, I am Jaal Mann. I'm the lead forester with Northwest Natural Resource Group. So first, I wanted to give a disclaimer that I am not a contract lawyer. This is not legal advice. Always talk to your lawyer to make sure your contract does what you think it does. What I am going to provide here is a discussion of what we think you might want to have in your contract, but not the legal specifics of how to make sure that that contract is enforceable. So the first one thing I wanted to touch on here is when do we enter into a contract? So typically the logger will come out and look at a project and get you logging prices. You agree to those or don't, and once you've agreed to work with them, that's when you get the contract before any work actually begins. Ideally, it's well before any work actually begins, but it can take time to get prices from the loggers, to get things signed, and in reality, it often we end up signing contracts pretty much right before a project begins. But if you can get a logger to sign on well in advance, that's definitely in your best interest to kind of lock them in, get them a little bit more committed to it. So why even have a contract? We think contracts are really essential to document expectations and prescriptions. They also, of course, provide legal leverage in case things go sideways, but usually we use our contracts more as reference documents when we need to remind ourselves what we decided about a certain portion of a project. We're trying to remember how many snags did they agree to create, what was the hourly cost for the chainsaw work, things like that. It's really nice to have them all together in one place, which all parties have seen and agreed to. It's also really important to make sure that you and the logger both really know what's in the contract. So definitely make sure to read your contracts carefully, especially if you're getting a contract from someone else that you didn't write. So we're gonna dive into our template contract here, and it basically starts with kind of general recitals and agreements. Nothing super interesting here, kind of just setting the stage for the rest of the contract. But the first more interesting thing we have in there is the harvest period. So we feel like it's really important to have an end date when everything must be completed, just to set expectations. You do need to have language in there allowing it to be extended, uh, allowing it to be extended, because delays can and do happen. If any of you have done your own logging projects, I imagine that things probably didn't all happen right on time. Um, but if you do have specific dates that you'd like to have a project done, you've got a family gathering coming up or the start of the rainy season, something like that, you could use that date. But if you don't have anything particular, we'll often just set a random date sometime after you expect the project to be completed. Projects often do take longer than expected, though. Weather delays, breakdowns, and the logger can also be delayed on projects before getting to yours, so they might start yours late. So usually we do have to extend the harvest period, or often we do. But I think it's still valuable to have that set so that there is the initial expectation of when when they should expect to finish it, and then you can extend from there rather than not giving any sort of timeline, and then you kind of can keep getting pushed down the road by other projects that do have a time limit. Next section here, you've got termination or suspension. Basically, what or how, who can terminate the contract under what circumstances. So the owner should be able to terminate it if the logger generally isn't competent, if they cause excess damage, if they let their insurance lapse, um, they breach any other contract requirement, or if markets drop substantially. So we usually have this clause if the markets drop over 20% within the window of the contract, then the contract can be canceled or renegotiated. That's especially important in per ton or per 1,000 board foot contracts where the logger would still make the same amount of money if the market dropped, so the landowner could end up losing quite a bit. The owner can also suspend and eventually cancel the contract if the logger has excessive delays. So excessive delays we define them as greater than 14 days. At that point, it requires a written plan to get back to full operations, and the contract can be terminated if that's not followed. We ended up adding this clause about excessive delays after we had some issues with loggers who were dealing with staffing and equipment problems that just dragged on and on. So this clause gives you the ability to set clear expectations for a return to full operations and to cancel the contract if they don't adhere to it. The owner can also suspend the contract if they believe they'll suffer material damage by operations continuing or if they lose legal rights for the timber harvest. The legal rights one is especially important if you were to sell the property or if you're a timber rights owner but not a property owner and something changes. That's important to have in there. And now here we also, in a lot of cases, give the logger the right to terminate the contract if markets drop more than 20%. If they're working on a percentage basis, because if they're being paid on a percentage of the log value, then they're also affected by market changes. If they're being paid on a per ton or a per 1,000 board foot basis, then we usually won't have this clause in here because they're not really very affected by changes in the market. So if the contract is terminated, the logger won't do any more timber harvest. Owner will pay logger for harvest work done correctly through the termination date unless the logger owes money due to a breach of contract. There are some parts of the contract, like some environmental liabilities and other things that do persist through contract termination, which is what this part's about. And this piece is basically just saying this contract is a full agreement. So one party can't later say, hey, but you said that we could do it this other way. The contract is the final word. And of course, the signature page. We also include places for initials on every page. I think we could skip these initials. It's not strictly required, but they do help make sure everyone is actually looking at every page. So now we get on to exhibits. So Exhibit A is about the property itself, the contract area. It's details about the property location, where they're going to be working. We have this note here that the logger is not responsible for surveying boundaries. They're going to use previously flagged boundaries by either the owner or a forester. So the owner or the logger is liable for understanding the boundaries and following them as marked. But if the markings are wrong, that's not on them, essentially. And here we also have language giving access for the logger to enter the property for the purposes of the contract. And it just describes the access and notes that the logger is responsible for any county or other haul permits that they need to get. Oh, I got a question from John. Where do you address having proper logging permits in the contract? There is a section later on you'll see where we say that we have a permit that's approved and we will assign it to the logger. But this is assuming in most cases you already have a permit approved when we're doing these logging contracts. If you have worked with us, you know that we do a forest management services agreement if we're the forester. So that's between us and the landowner. And then this contract would be between the landowner and the logger. And we would facilitate it if we're the ones the foresters working on this. Okay, so this exhibit is kind of the prescription. So it talks about how the trees are marked. Lost my pointer. There we go. Talks about how the trees are marked, if they are marked. Sometimes we'll also have the logger do their own selection depending on the stand and the complexity of the prescription. It talks about how the trees are going to be cut and yarded and notes that damage should be minimized. This is a place that you can customize a bit. You can include specifics about protecting or cutting snags or standing dead trees for wildlife. Creating habitat piles, if that's something you want to do. Species selection is something you would include in here if the logger is doing their own tree selection. You definitely would want some more detail on the prescription if the logger is doing their own selection, where if you're marking all the trees or your forester's marking all the trees, you don't need as much detail here because that's basically decided between you and the forester. And then we also include language here that states the logger can only cut trees following the terms of the contract. Things that seem obvious, but still good to have in there. So this section talks about the logging methods and describes what parts of the operation the logger will do, what equipment is allowed, when weather might cause suspensions to avoid soil damage, how you're going to manage slash. Usually we're redistributing it out into the woods. And it also provides a maximum stump height to avoid merchantable wood being left on the stump unnecessarily. Though it also gives an exception for creating snags from non-merchantable tree butts. So that's what we're seeing here. This is a tree that had a pretty bad curve in the bottom of it. There's no value at the mill in that part of the log. So the logger was able to reach up with the feller buncher, cut it off up high, and that didn't take any extra work for them. So there's no extra cost to the landowner, but you get a nice little habitat snag. The higher they can reach and the larger the tree, the more value for habitat is in that. But there's always a little bit of value in that more than just leaving it on the forest floor, which would be the other option. There's supposed to be something on this one. Looks like a PowerPoint issue. I might need to stop sharing for a moment and then see if that gets fixed. Let me reopen that real quick. Sorry, it's a whole process to reshare and everything. Okay. All right, that's where we were. Cool. So yeah, this section describes road conditions. So the laser pointer. The owner does not promise here that the roads will work for logging operations, and the logger is assuming that risk based on their own judgment, having seen the roads. It discusses whether new roads are going to be built, and who's going to be responsible for any road construction or maintenance needed. As we have it written here, in most cases, the logger will do the road upgrade work at their own cost, but the owner will pay for any rock that's needed. And the reason we usually do it that way is that rock is an investment in the property long term, and the owner might want the bare minimum to get the project done, or they might want more to improve the road's condition for future use. So it's nice to have the cost of the rock and therefore the decision on how much rock to use fall on the landowner. It's also pretty hard to tell ahead of time how much rock's going to be needed, and rock is really expensive. So it would be hard for the logger to build that into their pricing if they don't know exactly how much rock is going to be needed. If the road does need substantial improvements before the work begins, it's not uncommon for the logger to request a separate roadwork payment, which would be a lump sum cost or hourly time and materials, and that's something you would add into their section on payment in the contract here a little later on. It's also a good idea to include language in this section specifying if any materials purchased by the logger and passed through to the owner are going to have any markup on them. 10% markup is not uncommon, but a lot of loggers don't charge a markup, so that's definitely something to ask about and to put in the contract. Oops. It should also state that the logger is going to provide road closure permits and safety signage as necessary, and describe post-logging repairs to the skid roads, hiking trails, and landings. You need to decide if you want to have them fully cleared off for easy walking or slash scattered over them to reduce erosion. Just gonna make sure we don't have anyone else trying to come in right now. Realized I'm. Double check that. Okay, cool. I see we got another question from John real quick about responsibility for damage to county roads to access the property being logged. That's an interesting question. It's not something that we address directly in the contract anywhere. I think generally that any damage that happens to county roads would be the logger's responsibility, as you know, they're the ones doing that, and they are independent contractors. They're not your employees or anything, and that's established later on in the contract. So I think that would cover that pretty well, but it's not something that we have in the contract. And it's an interesting thought, might be worth considering whether we should have anything in there about it. And yeah, I guess that's one thing I would say about this contract template too, is that, you know, we've worked with some contract attorneys to kind of help create contract templates and some language, and then we've kind of improved and adjusted things over time. So it's a working document. You know, we often will update it every couple of months. We'll find something, oh, you know, it'd be better if it was slightly changed this way or that way. So it's not a completely static thing, and it definitely is not unheard of to figure out something new that should be included. And hopefully you figure that out not by running into a problem with that issue. You just think of it ahead of time, but not always the case. So this next one's just a important but not super interesting section. Logger has to supervise their own employees and subcontractors. They need to have someone on site who can receive instructions. They can't discriminate in their hiring practices, and they need to have driver's licenses and insurance. So equipment, we say that we want to have all equipment cleaned before coming onto the property to avoid spreading invasive species. This is an important one, but also a difficult one to enforce. It's really helpful to reduce invasive species if the loggers do wash off their equipment well. But if you include this clause, you should make sure to remind the logger about it just before they move equipment onto your property. Equipment should also be maintained to prevent fluid leakage. This is a good one to have in here. It does say limit the leakage of fluid, which is appropriate because logging equipment does leak. It's just the reality of it. Old seals, you have hydraulic lines that'll break sometimes. What's also important is making sure the loggers know that you expect them to clean up any significant spills by removing the contaminated soil. And we have a section on spills a little later on here. If you've got specific areas you don't want equipment to operate in, this is a place you can note that. We generally say we don't want them to be near any stream channel or wetlands. But this could also include things like if you have a septic drain field or an area of the forest that you like to go pick mushrooms or something, you don't want equipment in there, anything like that. And then here we state the equipment that should be removed from the property by the termination date of the contract or sooner with written notice. And we provide a timeline for the owner to dispose of any abandoned equipment at the logger's cost. So we haven't ever had to attempt to confiscate a logger's abandoned equipment, but this is important to include so you don't end up with an abandoned piece of equipment and no legal way to remove it. Disposal activities, these are things like slash management, trash removal, road cleanup. Our slash is generally redistributed out into the woods, which is what the skidder's doing here. It's got a grapple full of tree tops, taking back out from the landing into the woods. Fire control. I think this gets at the question John asked in the chat. That we do require the logger to notify the owner and the Department of Natural Resources about any fires. They need to have the appropriate equipment for the season, which is usually a fire trailer if you're in the fire season between April 15th and October 15th, and sometimes extended. They need to follow the industrial fire precaution level system rules, which is the DNR's fire danger system, and that they have different restrictions depending on how high the fire danger is. And we do say we're not going to have any slash burning. And that's because generally we're doing thinnings where the slash is redistributed out into the woods, so we really just have no need to do any burning. And John, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to rephrase or ask again, but I think that did. Environmental matters. So this is basically talking about spills are the biggest thing here. So we say we want them to essentially avoid spills. We want them to have a spill kit, and we want them to have a process for notification and cleanup of spills. So they're going to notify the owner and forester of any spills near within 200 feet of water bodies, or if it's more than 4 ounces in any other location, and responsible for removal, cleanup, remediation, as recommended by forester or required by law. Safety, just stating that they're responsible for their own worker safety and use of personal protective equipment, meeting L&I standards. Move out, stating the logger must get approval before removing equipment. Otherwise, they can be liable for the move-in costs to bring the equipment back, which can be thousands of dollars. So it's an important item because the loggers are usually eager to move on to the next project when they're finishing up your project. And this basically ensures that they won't remove equipment before they have approval from the forester to do so following a final inspection. That brings us to Exhibit D, preservation responsibilities. This basically talks about residual timber, again, because we're thinning in pretty much every case that we're working in. We want to make sure that they're not doing a lot of damage to the leaf trees. So we're establishing what a damaged tree is and also how many damaged trees qualifies as excessive damage. And we've essentially taken these amounts of what's excessive damage and what's a damaged tree from the various studies online and also from the DNR state sale contracts. They use a pretty similar system to this to determine excessive damage, which we felt was pretty reasonable. So we've adopted something pretty similar to that. Essentially, we're saying a tree is damaged if it has more than 1 square foot or 144 square inches of bark removal, or if the top is broken or the live crown ratio is reduced below 30%. So if enough branches are broken off that there's less than 30% live crown or live canopy, then that tree is not going to have the photosynthetic capacity to really take advantage of the light and nutrients and water that it has after the thinning. So that's going to adversely affect that tree. Or if it has more than a third of the circumference of its root system injured. So some trees do get damaged. That's just the reality with thinning, especially if you're doing, a dense thinning, and if it's springtime, the bark comes off really easily. But we consider the damage excessive if more than 5% of the leaf trees are damaged in a unit, so 1 in 20. And if that does happen, then we can require them to stop or change logging methods or do something to improve things. So a couple examples. This is a tree that clearly got hit with a machine or with a log, but it's not a damaged tree by this definition because the damaged area is less than 1 square foot. And then over here on the right, this tree is clearly damaged. It was right next to a landing and must have gotten banged up quite a bit. That tree might survive and heal over, or it might die and become a wildlife habitat snag. And this one here is also clearly damaged, though this one was actually damaged not by logging, but by a bear. Another rule of thumb some people also use is the damage, if it's larger than the size of a hard hat, then that's considered a damaged tree, which is pretty similar to the 1 square foot rule. This is something we actually have added in more recently. It's not really a change in policy or anything like that, but it essentially documents things that we're already having the loggers do and gets it into the contract. So there's specific things to watch out for. Deep ruts are one of the biggest things that'll happen when you're operating in an area when it's wet, where the soils really don't hold up to it well. So we'll have them put limbs and other slash in the skid trails to spread out the machine weight and reduce soil compaction. There's a couple examples of that. These are low value pulp logs put in a wet area to stop the machine from sinking. Over here is kind of the same idea, but across the trail. Sometimes we'll have the loggers wait until the weather improves to work in areas that are particularly saturated. So there might be some areas that are wetter than other parts of the project, making sure that they're focusing on the right areas during the right weather. Installing chains or traction devices on their skidder wheels or switching to tracked skidding when things get wet. And water barring skid trails so that you don't have water running down the skid trails, concentrating, and then delivering sediment into the streams. We generally we consider a rut to be excessive if it's more than 12 inches deep compared to the surrounding undisturbed soil. So that's indicating that things are too wet for the combination of equipment and the conditions that you're working in. I see a question there from Scott about whether there should be liquidated damages paid to the owner when leaf tree damages exceed the limit. We generally haven't tried to use liquidated damages in our contracts. It's always kind of a balancing act between protecting the landowner and making a project attractive enough to a logger. Where generally, if we're operating as the foresters, we're out there pretty regularly. We're working with loggers who we know and we have some level of trust with. And between us being out there regularly to notice these things when they're happening and working with loggers who we know, we find that we don't really need to have a liquidated damages clause in there. It's certainly an option. On state timber sales and federal sales, they do often have liquidated damages. So it's just a matter of trying to make sure that your project is still attractive enough to get loggers coming in and to get reasonable log prices, while also trying to protect the landowner as much as possible. So this is an example of some ruts over 12 inches that would definitely be a concern and would lead us to think we need to change how the things are being done on that area, and also to be repaired after as soon as they can. So their logger is liable to any damage to natural or built features on the property and surrounding properties. This one is inadvertent discovery of cultural resources. So this is a good idea to include an inadvertent discovery policy in your contract. Tribes will sometimes also request landowners have one if a project is taking place in an area they believe is more likely to have cultural resources. It basically says the logger needs to be on the lookout for cultural resources and they need to stop work in the area near them if found. So the owner can cancel the contract to protect the cultural resources, and if the logger does destroy or disturb them, they'll bear the costs of any restoration or any penalties. So after work in the area stops, this also just notes who will be notified and what the next steps are going to be. So it does state that any cultural sites or items over 50 years old should be protected. This is the official definition of a historic or cultural resource, but it's clear that not all 50-year-old things need protection. Sometimes you'll find old pieces of logging cable or old growth stumps with springboard notches. Just a couple examples, but there's not really any requirement to protect those kinds of things. So, except many landowners do want to protect, old growth stumps. People see a lot of value in those. So it's something to discuss ahead of time with your forester and with the logger. And if you or your forester aren't sure whether a cultural resource warrants protection, you can contact the county cultural resources coordinator or historic preservation officer, depending on your county, to get their thoughts on that, whether it's something that warrants a special protection. So this habitat and wildlife section states the logger is going to protect endangered species, including additional protections beyond what the law requires if the owner desires it, which is an interesting clause. It lets you go beyond the law, but it does give an option for them to be compensated for the extra work that it might take to provide extra protections. You can also here note that you don't want any felling of dead trees here, except where required for safety. We include this section in the contract about the not felling dead trees, but we do defer to the logger when it comes to which trees need to come down for safety reasons. Snags can be a major hazard, especially to people working outside of machines, and L&I often will require loggers to remove them or top them in areas where they'll be working. Also, we have our standard language here stating that no dead wood will be yarded or cut, but there are some cases where the freshly dead trees might still have value at the mill. So you could consider whether you might want to leave all of those for habitat purposes, or maybe you want to salvage some of the dead standing or downed wood to bring to the mill. Here's an nice example of a big snag that's being used not by an endangered species, but by a very cute species. And I think I saw someone on the call here who will recognize the photo. Markers. Surveyors are very expensive. If you've ever hired one, you'll know that. So the logger must protect property corners and witness markers, or resurvey them if they destroy them. This section just talks about how the logger is going to fill out load tickets, and they'll send logs to mills that are approved by the owner or forester. The owner is going to retain ownership of the logs until the mill pays for them. So the logger does not take ownership, but then the logger transports the logs at their own risk. So this is typical for a relatively small project like we work with small landowners, is that you're not selling the standing timber to the logger. You're essentially hiring them to do the logging for you as a service instead of selling them the timber. Like if you look at state or federal sales, then the logger is usually buying the timber, and in that case they take ownership earlier in the process. Or they do take ownership. In this case, the logger never actually takes ownership of the logs. The logger does pay the weighing costs, and they weigh only at approved scales. And they should generate a production report and have the load tickets. And you can have them send you the production report and the load tickets, or we'll sometimes just have the loggers send the load tickets if they don't generally produce a production report. You can also require them to send you any mill receipts so that you or your forester can independently verify that everything looks right. So here we say logs are only going to be sold to mills the owner or forester approve, and that the forester is going to contact the mill ahead of time to set up the payments. It helps make sure that the payments get split properly at the mill. So it describes how mill payments are going to be sent. Usually they are split at the mill between the logger and the owner, sometimes also to the truck. In most cases, when we're doing a project, we have the owner's revenue come to us so that we can verify it against the production reports and the mill receipts, make the necessary payments out of the revenue on the owner's behalf, and then send the balance to the landowner. For the haul rates here, we note who will pay the trucks. In this case, the logger is going to pay for the hauling, and what mills they agree to send the logs to. So we include specific mills here because depending on the haul payment scheme, some parties could otherwise have an incentive to bring logs to a mill that disincentivizes the other party. So, for example, here, if the logger is paying the full cost of the hauling, then the landowner might want the logger to send logs to a farther away mill for a slightly higher log price, which would benefit the landowner but harm the logger. If the trucking and hauling is off the top, so taken off before you divide between the logger and the landowner, with something near a 50-50 split, then it's less essential to list the destinations because the landowner and the logger incentives are pretty well aligned. But it can still be helpful to include them just so everyone can see what sort of hauling distances they're agreeing to. So here we finally get to the logger payment rates. Sometimes it's per 1,000 board feet or per ton, but on the kinds of projects we work on, more often it's a percentage of the log revenue. Either with trucking included in the logging rate, so paid by the logger, or off the top, deducted before doing the split, so that each party is paying a proportionate share of the trucking. This is also the place where you can include any habitat pile or snag creation quantities and hourly rates for any additional work beyond the scope of the contract, which is good to have in case you want them to do some extra bit of road work while they're there, or you can take down a couple extra hazard trees, move a boulder around in your yard, really anything extra that they happen to agree to. You already have rates in place, so you don't need to get a separate contract for that. Here we describe how the payments to the logger will be made, and this is an either or here, where usually we're using a mill split so that to get a more timely payment. But another option is you can have the owner receive all the funds and pay the logger, and then you can include language that you can hold back the final payment until you get a satisfactory inspection. This does add some extra protection to the landowner, but it also does make your project a little less attractive to the logger because it's going to slow down their payments for the funds to go to the owner or to the forester first, and then have them have to pay to the logger, and it can be a cash flow issue in some cases. So we will usually stick with a mill split, though it is worth considering which option you want to do here. So this just states that the owner will pay the forest excise taxes and the B&O excise taxes if that applies, but the logger is going to pay any other taxes or fees related to their income or payroll. This is where we document insurance requirements. We generally require what you see here, $1 million policy for auto, commercial, general liability, logger's broad form. There have been some cases where someone's tried to, or a client or some potential client has tried to increase these requirements. And we found that that's really difficult to do because these are kind of the standard limits, and the loggers can't really change insurance to suit each job. So if they do up their insurance limits, that's going to be for, whatever the remaining time in their current period is. It could be up to that whole year. They can't just be shifting back and forth between policies. So that's something you'll likely get pushback on if you do try to go beyond kind of these standard limits. We do have here that the owner and forester should be listed as additional insured on the logger's policy, and that means that each party is going to get an insurance certificate from the insurer. Bonding, we state here no bond is requested. You could request a performance bond, but it's pretty uncommon for logging projects that aren't state or federal timber sales, larger projects. It again comes to make sure the project is attractive and that you're able to get good bids. Something like a performance bond does add some complexity and extra costs to the logger to either get a commercial bond or to set aside the cash for that. So here's where we just note the FPA number and that it will be assigned to the logger. We state that the logger doesn't rely on any owner or forester implied representations of the project. They're relying on their own assessment, and that they're going to follow the laws. And now we're in these legal terms section. I'm going to run through the rest of these pretty quickly because it's kind of boilerplate stuff. This one is a gigantic paragraph which basically just says that the logger is an independent contractor. Here we're saying the logger is responsible for injury, death, or damage to workers or other people in connection to the operations, so shifting some liability to them. General indemnity, another legal term stating the logger is generally responsible for anything bad that happens related to the contract, unless it's caused by the intentional wrongdoing or gross negligence of the owner. The waiver of immunity is an interesting one because Washington law says if a logger's employee gets injured and they get workers' comp, then the logger is immune from suit by the employee, and that's not just logging. That's in any business. So that means the employee could still sue the owner, who's not immune, for full damages if they think that the owner is liable. So by having the logger agree to this waiver of immunity, then the employee could sue the logger even if they're on workers' comp, which does reduce the risk of lawsuit to the owner. So this is shifting some more liability to the logger, but it's something that that is fairly common and we generally haven't gotten pushback on. Legal proceedings, just stating that the prevailing party will get legal fees if there's a lawsuit, the county where lawsuits will be handled, and that the owner isn't liable for damages. Waivers, this stating that the owner's failure to insist on strict compliance of a provision in the contract doesn't weaken any other provisions of the contract. So if there's something you decide you don't want to enforce exactly as written in the contract, everything else is still just as enforceable. Severability states if there are any provisions that turn out to be unenforceable or illegal, those are stricken, but the rest of the contract still stands. Here saying the logger won't assert any liens against logs, timber, property, etc., and the logger is liable for any breach of contract occurring before contract termination. The logger and owner will coordinate media strategies if there's any public interest in the project, and the logger cannot subcontract without written consent. So this one often does come up. So make sure the logger knows that they need written consent from the owner before subcontracting. It's pretty common for loggers to subcontract for the cutting, for example, and you want to require them to get permission so that you have more control over who's going to be doing the actual work on your property. And finally, we just have the address and delivery method for any legal notices to both parties, noting either party can request changes, but changes have to be mutually agreed to, and that if the owner or forester provided the contract form, a note that the logger has been advised to consult their legal counsel and that you don't have legal exposure for providing the initial contract form. All right, well, that is the full contract template and everything in there. And I hope you're all still awake at 8:15 on a Wednesday after going through a full contract. But if anyone has any other questions or comments or thoughts in general, I'm happy to hear them now. Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just go ahead and unmute and ask that. Scott asks if we'll share the form. Yes, I think we can share this template contract with you all so you can kind of read through that in a little more detail. John notes the county may require the logger to post a bond related to potential road or property damage. Um, Interesting. Yeah, I don't think that's a scenario I've seen yet. I wonder if if that's associated with a new road approach or something along those lines. I don't know if you have any more detail on that, John.
Joe, could you mention the role of purchase orders and how they relate to the logging contract?
Sure. Yeah, we don't really have anything specific in the contract about purchase orders, but we do talk about how um, the logger can only send logs to mills that the forester, the owner, has talked to on their behalf. So that covers that a little to some extent. Some mills will do purchase orders, some don't, which is why we're not really putting that in there. But if we're contacting the mill on their behalf and talking to the mill ahead of time, then we can kind of get out ahead of that. And if they do need to have a purchase order in place, we would have the opportunity to figure that out and get things set up before it actually goes to the mill. All right, well, just give another minute or so if anyone's got any final questions, and then I think we can uh, call it an evening. All right, well, I'm glad some of you found this useful, and yeah, feel free to reach out later on. I think we'll probably send that contract around uh, tomorrow, I imagine. If you have any questions as you start looking through that, or just other thoughts, feel free to reach out to me or anyone else at NNRG. I'm Jaal at NNRG. It's Jaal at nnrg.org. And yeah, let me or anyone else know if you've got anything else. Nice to see some familiar faces here tonight. And yeah, I will see you all on the next one. All right. Bye, everyone.